Of all the iconic superhero properties to grace the big screen, has there ever been one with a legacy so important, yet a filmography so consistently disappointing as the Fantastic Four? It's a question that's baffled fans for decades now. This is Marvel's first family, the very cornerstone of their comic book universe, yet they've become one of Hollywood's most cursed IPs. We've had three distinct modern attempts to bring them to life. First, the light-hearted, campy duo of films from the mid-2000s, which had moments of charm but ultimately felt shallow, and then of course the now infamous 2015 reboot, which was a grim and gritty disaster that imploded so spectacularly. It's a Hollywood cautionary tale. Now that the MCU has finally delivered its long-awaited take on the Fantastic Four, it feels more relevant than ever to understand why it took so long to get it right. In this video, we're going to get to the bottom of what went wrong, what, if anything, they got right, and why a truly Fantastic Four movie has remained so stubbornly out of reach. Now, before we can properly tear into these movies, we have to understand what they were trying and failing to adapt. Back in 1961, when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby cooked up the Fantastic Four, they weren't just creating another superhero team. They were laying the very first brick of the Marvel Universe as we know it. A gamble that paid off in a way nobody could have predicted. And the single most important theme, the one ingredient that every single one of these movies fumbled in some way, was family. The Fantastic Four weren't just colleagues who got zapped by cosmic rays, they were a dysfunctional, bickering, yet fiercely loyal family unit first and superheroes second. This is the cornerstone of their entire identity, and if you miss that, you miss the whole point. Unlike pretty much every other hero at the time hiding behind a mask, the Four were public figures. They were celebrities. They were explorers and scientists based out of the iconic Baxter Building, getting hounded by paparazzi and signing autographs. Hell, Stan Lee himself even existed as a mailman in their world. This wasn't a story about secret identities, it was about navigating global fame with newfound, often terrifying powers. This created a tone that was completely unique. It was part high concept, way out there science fiction, part light-hearted adventure, and part soap opera. You had Reed Richards, the genius who was emotionally constipated and often ignored his fiancée Sue, who in turn just wanted to feel seen. You had the hot-headed Johnny Storm constantly messing with their ever-tragic Ben Grimm, who was dealing with the fact that his transformation cost him his old life. It was this blend of cosmic adventure and grounded human drama that made them special. It's the tightrope that any good Fantastic Four adaptation has to walk. And as we're about to see with the 2005 film, it's a tightrope that's incredibly easy to fall off of. So to understand why the 2005 movie ended up the way it did, we have to look at the landscape at the time. The early 2000s were the Wild West for superhero films. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man and Fox's own X-Men were printing money, proving that comic book movies weren't just for kids anymore. So naturally, 20th Century Fox looked at their assets, saw that they were sitting on the rights to Marvel's first family, and thought, we want a piece of that pie. But this wasn't their first attempt at making a Fantastic Four movie. No, there's a dirty little secret, a skeleton in the closet that is the infamous unreleased 1994 film from the legendary B-movie king, Roger Corman. This thing was never meant for theaters. It was a low-budget, slapped-together piece of garbage made for one reason and one reason only, so that producer Bernd Eichinger wouldn't lose the film rights. It was a movie designed as a rights retainer and nothing more. In fact, Marvel's own Avi Arad reportedly brought up the prince just to make sure this embarrassment never saw the light of day. This is the energy the Fantastic Four was bringing into the 21st century. An IP so mismanaged, its first movie had to be buried. Like, great start. So with a clean slate technically, Fox moved forward, and for the director's chair they picked Tim Story, the guy who brought us Barbershop. Now look, I'm not knocking Barbershop, but when you're trying to launch a flagship sci-fi adventure franchise to compete with Spider-Man, it's a choice that definitely makes you raise an eyebrow. To his credit, Story was a fan of the comics and said all the right things. He wanted to avoid an outright comedy and find a balance between jokes and drama, aiming for something that felt like a lighthearted, fun adventure comic. The intent was there, on paper at least. But as we all know, the road to hell, or in this case, a painfully mediocre movie, is paved with good intentions. Then came the casting, which is probably the most fascinating and divisive part of this whole production. And let's be honest, they got one thing absolutely, unequivocally perfect. Chris Evans as Johnny Storm. He was arrogant, he was a womanizer, he was endlessly charismatic. He was the Human Torch. It was brilliant casting, no notes. And I'd argue they got another one pretty damn right with Michael Chiklis as Ben Grimm. Chiklis was a genuine fan of the comics and was the only one who fought for a practical suit, enduring a 60-pound latex nightmare for the role. And it paid off. You felt his pain, his frustration. Stan Lee himself even called it his favorite performance in any Marvel movie. And if Stan Lee says it's good, who are we to argue? But then we get to our other two. Ewan Griffith as Reed Richards was fine, I guess. He looked the part, but he never quite captured the obsessive, brilliant, yet socially inept core of the character. And then there's Jessica Alba as Sue Storm. Now, this is where you can really see the 2005 studio mindset at work. Alba was a massive star at the time, so they cast her. But her experience on set sounds like a nightmare. She was famously told to cry pretty for emotional scenes because her real crying was apparently too painful to watch. So they just CGI the tears in later because God forbid an actress actually, acts. This one anecdote tells you everything you need to know about the film's priorities. Surface level aesthetics over any kind of genuine emotion. The film was budgeted at around $100 million and Fox had massive expectations. They wanted this to be their Spider-Man, and financially for a moment, it looked like they got it. The movie opened at number 1 and went on to make over $330 million worldwide. So by Hollywood logic, it was a success, but the critics and a huge chunk of the audience felt very differently. It was widely panned as bland, boring, and just cheesy. The money was there, but the soul was missing, and this is where the cracks in the foundation of this version of the franchise really start to show. Now look, I'm about to spend a good portion of this video tearing this movie a new one for its paper-thin plot and one of the most pathetic comic book villains ever put to screen, but let's be fair. For all its cheesy dialogue and dated effects, the 2005 Fantastic Four wasn't a complete write-off. In fact, it got a few crucial things so right that it's honestly frustrating because you can see the glimmers of a genuinely good movie buried under all the mid-2000s schlock. And credit where credit's due, the movie doesn't waste any time. In an era where origin stories can drag on for an entire film, Tim's story gets our crew on that space station and zapped with the cosmic rays in about 8 minutes. No messing around, it understands that we're here to see the superpowers and the dysfunctional family dynamic, and it gets us there fast. It makes a conscious decision to lean into the campy, lighthearted vibe of the early comics, and while that tone is a double-edged sword, which we'll talk about later, it at least feels like they read the source material. But the single best thing this movie did, the one element that carries the entire film on its back, is the chemistry between two of its leads. I've already said it, but Chris Evans was Johnny Storm. He was arrogant, charming, and just perfectly annoying. And Michael Chiklis as Ben Grimm, it's a performance born from pure passion. This was a guy who was a huge fan of the comics, who fought for that practical suit, endured 60 pounds of latex to bring the thing to life. And you feel it. You feel his pain, his frustration, his reluctant heroism. But when you put these two on screen together, that's where the magic happens. Their constant bickering, the pranks, the insults, that was the beating heart of the movie. It's the closest any of these films got to capturing that essential family dynamic. The montages of them learning their powers and trying to live together in the Baxter building are genuinely charming. It's a fun, chaotic glimpse into a dysfunctional family figuring it all out. And for those moments, the movie just works. It also managed to deliver a few moments of surprising, genuine heart. The scene where Ben's fiance sees him for the first time as the Thing and just can't handle it, leaving him shattered, that's a real gut punch. In a movie full of goofy one-liners, this was a moment of actual pathos that gave Chiklis's character some much-needed weight. And this pays off beautifully in what is, make no mistake, one of the most iconic scenes in early superhero cinema, the Brooklyn Bridge sequence. Ben Grimm stopping that truck isn't just a cool action beat, it's the moment he accepts who he is. It's the first time the public sees him not as a monster, but as a hero. It's pure, unadulterated comic book goodness, and it still holds up. Even the climax, for all its silliness, has one smart idea. They don't just punch Dr. Doom harder. They use their powers and Reed's intellect together using science, supercooling, and intense heat to take him down. It's a small detail, but it's a nod to the fact that they're scientists, not just brawlers. And you have to give it up for the score. The main theme is phenomenal, an instantly recognizable and heroic piece of music that feels more iconic than the movie was written for. So yeah, the 2005 film is flawed, it's cheesy, it's shallow, and its villain is a joke, but it had charm. It understood the importance of the family dynamic, even if it only scratched the surface. It had a perfect Human Torch, a fantastic Thing, and a handful of scenes that genuinely captured the spirits of the comics. It was, for better or worse, the closest we've ever gotten to a Fantastic Four movie that at least felt like it had a soul. At least until now. But for every ounce of that charm, there was a pound of cringe, and that takes us to what went wrong. And boy, there was a lot. When you strip away the fun, Thing, and Torch dynamic, you're left with a movie built on a foundation of wet cardboard. A bland script, some of the worst visual effects of the era, and a villain so pathetic he makes you wonder if you're watching a superhero film or a rejected pilot for a bad sitcom. And let's start right there, with the script. For a movie about a family of superpowered adventurers, the first hour is just excruciatingly slow. It's a giant build-up to the characters getting their powers, but in that time, literally nothing happens. The dialogue is painfully bland. Characters often feel like they're just walking on screen to say their line and then immediately leave. The whole thing has this cheap, fake stage universe feel, where even the New York street scenes don't feel like anything is real, and instead of building character, the script gets bogged down explaining the most mundane details. Like dedicating screen time to show us that Reed's graying temples are a result of the cosmic rays, because that's what we were all wondering about. This blandness extends to our lead couple. Ioan Gruffudd's Reed Richards is just awkward. He comes across less like the smartest man in the world and more like an uncomfortable goofball. You just don't buy it. And the special effects for his stretching, my god. They were bad then, and they're somehow even worse now. His movements are so cartoony and disturbing, it looks like something straight out of Gary's Mod. And then there's the treatment of Sue Storm, which is where things get really cynical. Don't even get me started on the tasteless, demeaning running joke of her clothes not turning invisible, forcing her to strip. It's cheap, it's lazy, and it reduces the most powerful member of the team to pure eye candy. But all of it, pales in comparison to what they did to one of the greatest villains in comic book history. Let's talk about Dr. Doom. Where do we even begin with this absolute travesty? They took the tyrannical, genius sorcerer king of Latveria and turned him into a generic, jealous businessman. He's basically a carbon copy of Willem Dafoe's Norman Osborn from Spider-Man, right down to the character arc, but with none of the charisma. Julian McMahon's performance, may he rest in peace, is just a little terrible. There's no threat, there's no gravitas. The legendary world-shaking rivalry between Doom and Richards from the comics is reduced to them squabbling over Sue Storm. His motivations are bizarre and undercooked, and his Latvian history, the very core of his character, is dismissed in a single throwaway line. He's not a threat, he's a pretentious, Sue Storm-stalking douchebag who talks to himself to explain his evil plan. And then, after being absent for most of the movie, he just shows up in the final 15 minutes in a metal suit with vaguely defined electricity powers, looking less like the Monarch of Latveria and more like a rejected Power Rangers villain. It is, without exaggeration, one of the worst and most insulting adaptations of a major comic book villain ever put to screen. It's not just a failure, it's a complete misunderstanding of what made the character iconic in the first place. This movie didn't just get Doom wrong, it didn't even try to get him right. So the 2005 film, despite being critically panned as a cheesy, shallow mess, still managed to rake in over $330 million. And in the eyes of a Hollywood studio, that is not a failure, that's a green light. Fox immediately put a sequel into production, promising everyone that this time they'd get it right. They were going to up the ante, introduce iconic new characters, and finally deliver the epic adventure the first movie should have been. The marketing was all about course correction. So did they stick the landing? Did they listen to the feedback and deliver the movie we were all hoping for? Well, kinda, but not really. To its credit, Rise of the Silver Surfer is in many ways a better movie than its predecessor. It feels more confident in its tone, and crucially, it understands that its greatest asset is the team dynamic. The movie hits the ground running with the four already established as a celebrity family, and their chemistry is much improved. The banter feels more natural, and the brotherly rivalry between Johnny and Ben is still the absolute beating heart of the film. Their scenes together are genuinely funny and carry the whole damn movie. And then there's the surfer himself. Look, say what you will about this film, but they absolutely nailed the Silver Surfer. He looks perfect. The design is sleek, comic accurate, and genuinely awe-inspiring. Bringing in the legendary Doug Jones for the physical performance and Lawrence Fishburne for that deep, commanding voice, that's peak casting times 2. The chase scene where Johnny goes after him through the city is without a doubt the single best action sequence in the entire Tim Story duology. For those 5 minutes, you feel like you're watching a genuinely great superhero movie. The action is bigger, Johnny gets a surprisingly solid character arc where he actually learns to be selfless, and the moment he absorbs all 4 powers to fight Doom is legitimately awesome. For a brief shining moment, it felt like they were on the right track. But for every single thing this movie got right, it got something else catastrophically wrong. And that brings us to the giant, gassy elephant in the room, Galactus. Or, as this movie would have you believe, a boring, nondescript cosmic storm cloud. My god. After hyping up the Devourer of Worlds, they gave us space weather. Director Tim Story later tried to backpedal, saying it was just a cloud surrounding Galactus' true form, but yeah, nobody was buying that. It was a cowardly, baffling decision that neutered one of Marvel's most terrifying cosmic threats and turned him into a joke. It's a perfect example of the studio being too scared to embrace the weird cosmic side of the source material. And speaking of neutered villains, let's talk about Doctor Doom again. Somehow, they made him even worse. He's back. He's handsome again with literally zero explanation for how he escaped his metal prison or fixed his face. And his motivations are even more baffling. He's still just a petty, jealous businessman who wants to steal the surfer's surfboard. That's it. That's the master plan from one of comics' greatest minds. Julian McMahon is still delivering a performance with all the menace of a high school principal, but it's like the writers just hit a reset button on a character that was already fundamentally broken. The entire plot is just paper thin. The fate of the entire planet feels like a B-plot to Reed and Sue's wedding planning drama, and the logic just completely falls apart at the end. The Silver Surfer, a being who has presided over the destruction of countless worlds, suddenly has a change of heart because Sue Storm reminds him of his girlfriend back home. He's fine with billions dying across the galaxy, but this one specific blonde woman makes him betray his cosmic master. Yeah, okay. It's a corny, unearned resolution that completely undermines the character. But ultimately, while the sequel made a decent amount of money, it made less than the first film. And in the cold, hard math of Hollywood, that is a death sentence. The lackluster reception and diminishing returns were enough for Fox to pull the plug, putting the franchise on ice for nearly a decade. Rise of the Silver Surfer had moments of genuine fun and a perfect Silver Surfer, but it was still crippled by the same fundamental flaws. A weak script, a pathetic villain, and a complete refusal to embrace the epic scale of the comics. It wasn't the disaster the next film would be, but it was the final disappointing nail in the coffin for this version of Marvel's first family. So with the Tim Story duology dead and buried under a pile of cheesy dialogue and diminishing box office returns, the Fantastic Four franchise went into a deep freeze. But over at 20th Century Fox, a clock was ticking. The deal was simple: make a new movie by 2015, or the rights to Marvel's first family would snap back to Marvel Studios. And in a pre-Disney acquisition world, Fox was not about to let one of their biggest IPs just walk out the door. So with their hands forced, they hit the big red panic-induced reboot button. Their solution? Swing the pendulum in the complete opposite direction. The bright, campy, family-friendly tone of the last two films was out. In its place, Fox wanted something dark, gritty, and grounded. They wanted their own Batman Begins, and to helm this new version, they hired Josh Trank, the hot new director fresh off the success of his found footage hit Chronicle. On paper, you can almost see the studio logic here. Chronicle was a dark, pseudo-realistic take on superpowers, so who better to ground the Fantastic Four than Josh Trank? Except there's one small problem, because when you think of the fun-loving, adventurous Fantastic Four, you obviously think of grotesque, flesh-warping Cronenberg body horror, right? Trank himself admitted he wasn't a big fan of the comics and wanted to make a bleak, almost horrifying film about the trauma of transformation. It was a concept so fundamentally at odds with the source material, it was doomed from the first pitch meeting. Then came the casting, and with it, the first wave of online drama. The studio assembled a seriously talented cast with Miles Teller, Michael B. Jordan, Kate Mara, and Jamie Bell, but Trank's insistence on casting Michael B. Jordan as Johnny Storm, a historically white character, sent the corners of the internet into a predictable meltdown. And in alleged retaliation, the studio apparently forced Trank to cast Kate Mara as Sue, a choice he was reportedly unhappy with. Mara later said Trank told her not to even bother reading the comics. When the director of your comic book movie is actively telling his lead actress to ignore the source material, you know you're in for a good time. Add to that the decision to turn the iconic Doctor Doom into an antisocial computer programmer and blogger named Viktor Domashev, and the fan backlash was already reaching critical mass before a single frame was shot. And that's when things went from a bad idea to a full-blown 5-alarm production hell. The stories that came out of this set are the stuff of Hollywood legend. The script, which reportedly went through 18 drafts, still didn't have a third act when filming began. Trank was described as erratic and isolated, allegedly hiding in a blacked-out tent on set and giving actors bizarrely minimal direction. There were reports of a near full-on fistfight with his star Miles Teller. Kate Mara called the experience horrible, and in what has to be the most baffling anecdote from this entire disaster, Trank's dogs allegedly caused over $100,000 worth of damage to his rented house, which Fox had to pay for. Because when your $120 million blockbuster is already derailing, what you really need is a subplot involving property damage and angry landlords. The mounting chaos and toxic word of mouth became so bad that it cost Trank the gig of a lifetime, directing a Star Wars Boba Fett movie for Lucasfilm. The whole situation was a feedback loop of dysfunction. Trank felt the studio was meddling with his dark vision, the studio saw a director who was in over his head, and a movie that was becoming completely unmarketable. This wasn't just a troubled production, it was a cinematic car crash in slow motion. And we haven't even gotten to the infamous wig and all reshoots that would try and spectacularly fail to stitch this Frankenstein's monster of a movie together. So how do you follow up a duology that was already seen as a cheesy, shallow failure? Well, if you're 20th Century Fox in 2015, you learn all the wrong lessons and create something so fundamentally broken, so devoid of joy, it makes the Tim Story films look like Citizen Kane. This isn't just a bad movie, it's a cinematic autopsy, a perfect case study in how to completely misunderstand and disrespect your own source material. And it all starts with the tone. Director Josh Trank was hired for his gritty, realistic take on superpowers in Chronicle, and he decided to bring that same energy here, aiming for a David Cronenberg-inspired body horror film. His words, not mine. He wanted to show these characters crawling out of hell, and in what has to be one of the most tone-deaf and frankly insulting changes in comic book movie history, they took the Thing's iconic fun catchphrase, "It's clobberin' time," and made it the line his abusive older brother would say before beating him as a child. Just what? This wasn't a dark and gritty deconstruction, it was just joyless. The movie is actively ashamed of being a comic book film, stripping away any sense of adventure or fantasy for a bleak, miserable slog. This tonal car crash is mirrored in the film's narrative, which is a Frankenstein's monster stitched together with studio-mandated reshoots, and you don't need to be a film student to spot them. You just need to look at Kate Mara's head. The jarring switch between her natural hair and that infamous cheap-looking blonde wig is so obvious. It becomes its own distracting subplot. The entire film feels like a 100-minute trailer for a movie that never actually happens. We get an hour of build-up and then a massive 1 year later time jump that skips over literally all of the most important character development. We don't see them learn to use their powers. We don't see them grapple with their new reality as a team. We just skip it because who needs character arcs when you can just jump to a rushed, nonsensical climax? It's a narrative cheat code of the highest order, and it leaves the movie feeling hollow and incomplete. But the biggest casualty of this grim tone and chaotic production was the one thing that should have been untouchable: the family. There is zero chemistry between these actors. Reed Richards, the supposed leader, comes off as a selfish coward who abandons his friends, including the man he turned into a rock monster for a whole year. Sue Storm is given a vague pattern recognition ability that goes nowhere. Johnny is completely underused, and Ben Grimm is turned into a government weapon with a confirmed kill count. The film completely fails to understand that the Fantastic Four are a family first, a trademark they've had since the damn 60s. The concluding scene where they awkwardly try to name themselves is just cringe-inducing. It's supposed to be a team uniting moment, but it just highlights how little these characters feel like they even know each other, let alone like each other. And then there's Dr. Doom. If you thought the Tim Story films had hit rock bottom with this character, then buddy, you haven't seen anything yet. They took the tyrannical monarch of Latveria and turned him into an antisocial computer programmer and blogger named Viktor Domashev, who goes by Doom Online. He's a pretentious, Sue-stalking douchebag whose motivation to destroy the world comes out of absolutely nowhere in the last 15 minutes. And his design? He looked like a melted crash test dummy wearing a garbage bag. He's meant to be this all-powerful being, yet his master plan in the final battle devolves into throwing rocks and getting into a fistfight. It is, without exaggeration, a complete character assassination, a masterclass in how to take one of comics' greatest villains and turn him into an absolute joke. Again. The fallout from the 2015 Fantastic Four wasn't a slow burn, it was an immediate, all-consuming dumpster fire. The critical reception wasn't just negative, it was a collective, unified panning of a level rarely seen. We're talking a toxic single-digit 9% on Rotten Tomatoes. Critics across the board weren't just disappointed, they were almost offended, calling it boring, dull, and lifeless, with one of the most out-of-place third acts ever made. The consensus was clear. This was a movie that got absolutely everything wrong, from the characters, to the story, to the villain. Many labeled it a 100-minute trailer for a movie that never happens, a ton of miserable build-up that leads to absolutely nothing. And the box office numbers were the final brutal confirmation of this failure. On a budget that ballooned to around $120 million, the film scraped together just under $168 million worldwide for a flagship superhero property. That is not just a flop, that's a financial crater. And just to rub salt into the gaping wound, the film proudly took home Razzies for Worst Picture, Worst Director, and Worst Remake of the Year. When you're sweeping the awards for cinematic failure, you know you created something truly special. But the single most fascinating and frankly self-destructive element of this whole disaster came not from the studio, but from the director himself. On the eve of the film's release, Josh Trank logged onto Twitter and posted what is now a legendary, career-immolating tweet. A year ago, I had a fantastic version of this, and it would have received great reviews. You'll probably never see it. That's reality, though. He then quickly deleted it, but the damage was done. He essentially took a grenade, pulled out the pin, and tossed it into the premiere screening on his way out the door. This wasn't just an angry tweet, it was a confirmation slip for every negative rumor that had plagued the production. A receipt for the disasters we were all about to witness. It was Trank throwing his own movie, the studio, and everyone he worked with under the bus, and it had a tangible impact. Industry insiders estimated that the tweet alone may have cost the film as much as $10 million on its already disastrous opening weekend. It was the final self-inflicted nail in the coffin. And the consequences for Trank were brutal. His frustration with the messy and combative creative process was understandable, but his public meltdown effectively put him in what is metaphorically known as director jail. The dysfunction on set became so infamous that it cost him the gig of a lifetime, which was his deal as a director of the Boba Fett movie for Lucasfilm, and it simply just fizzled out. It's one thing for your movie to fail, but it's another for it to cost you a trip to the Star Wars galaxy, which at the time was huge. For Fox, the immediate goal was Damage Control. The sequel that had been optimistically slated for 2017 was quietly wiped from the release schedule, killing a follow-up that, let's be honest, nobody wanted. The irony here is just staggering. Fox went through this entire cinematic ordeal, creating this abomination purely to keep the film rights from reverting to Marvel. They had even famously refused an earlier deal to trade Daredevil back to Marvel in exchange for keeping characters like Galactus and the Silver Surfer, only to bungle it all and end up losing everything anyway. This film's failure became a major reason they'd eventually lose it all. Ultimately, the colossal failure of Funtastic was the final clumsy nail in the coffin for Fox's stewardship of the brand. The continued bungling of one of Marvel's most important properties made it that much easier for Disney to swoop in and acquire the studio a few years later. In 2019, the deal was done and Marvel's first family was finally back home at Marvel Studios. So in a way, we have this train wreck to thank for the incredible MCU version that we now have. The 2015 film serves as a perfect textbook on what not to do, and judging by the final results, it's clear Kevin Feige read that textbook from cover to cover. So after revisiting these three wildly different yet equally flawed attempts to bring Marvel's first family to the big screen, what this all boils down to is one simple, unshakable truth. Not a single one of these films truly understood what the Fantastic Four are supposed to be. They're not just another superhero team, they are a family of celebrity scientists and adventurers first. And that's the one ingredient every single movie managed to get wrong. The Tim Story duology, for all its charm and the perfect casting of Chris Evans, got the tone fatally wrong. It leaned so hard into the campy, lighthearted vibe that it just became shallow. The plots were paper thin, the drama was non-existent, and its version of Doctor Doom was an absolute unforgivable insult. It captured a flicker of the family dynamic, sure, but it was a hollow victory. It was a movie with a bit of heart, but absolutely no brain. And then, in a classic case of Hollywood overcorrection, Josh Trank swung the pendulum so far in the other direction, it flew right off the hinges. It gave us a grim, joyless body horror slog that was so ashamed of its comic book roots, it forgot to have any fun whatsoever. The characters were miserable, the story was a stitched together mess, the family at its core was completely absent, it was all brain, or at least the ambition of one, and absolutely no heart. At the end of the day, a Fantastic Four movie has to walk that tightrope. It needs to balance the cosmic, high-concept science fiction with the grounded, bickering, but ultimately loving family drama. It's about adventure and heart, working in perfect harmony. It's a formula that seems so simple on paper, yet for 2 decades, it's been Hollywood's most impossible equation to solve. So after wading through the cinematic rubble of 2 decades and 3 failed Fantastic Four attempts, where does that leave us? Well, for the first time in a long time, there's a flicker of actual hope because the Fantastic Four are finally back home at Marvel Studios. And with Kevin Feige at the helm, the bar, let's be honest, is subterranean at this point. After the shallow camp of the story films and the joyless slog of the Trank disaster, they have a perfect studio-approved blueprint of exactly what not to do. And all they have to do is remember the core formula that everyone else seemed to forget: family, science, adventure, and heart. That's the tightrope. By finally nailing that balance, by giving us characters with genuine chemistry and a villain with a true sense of menace, they delivered the definitive film this property has always deserved. After so many fumbles and disappointments, it feels surreal to say that the wait is finally over and the curse appears to be broken. The conversation is no longer about cynical hopes or fears of another failure. So now, the question is for you. For those of you who have seen the MCU's Fantastic Four, I'm dying to know what you thought about it. Without giving away any spoilers, it's only just come out. What were your general impressions? Did the MCU finally give Marvel's First Family the film they've always deserved? Let me know in the comments below.